Hi, I'm Hayley Boyd. I'm the promotional director and a DJ at WLRA at Lewis University. Today, I'm here with country musician Kenny Vaughan, the guitar player for Marty Stuart and his Fabulous Superlatives. Some recent good news is that Marty got inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, and I know that you're inducted in the Colorado Country Music Hall of Fame. It is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this interview today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. So I'm going to start off with kind of an obvious question that I know a lot of your fans would know. You're referred to as Cousin Kenny, and I know a lot of the other members of your band have nicknames as well. How did you get your nickname?
Well, that's kind of funny. There's a backstory to the whole thing, but I'll tell you how I got the nickname with Marty Stuart. He just started calling me that. He likes to nickname everybody in his organization. It's a quirk that he has, and so everybody has one. He called me Cousin Kenny, which was kind of funny because I had been Cousin Kenny since I was 3 years old. When I was born in Oklahoma, but when I was 3, my father and mom moved back to Denver, where my father was from, which is where I was raised, and I had some cousins there, and one of them was named Ken, and so they called me Cousin Kenny from the time I was 3 until they still call me Cousin Kenny. So when I became Cousin Kenny, when I was, who knows, I must have been, I've been with Marty for 20 years, so I was 46 years old when I became Cousin Kenny. So again, but I was already Cousin Kenny. He didn't know that. So.
Oh, wow. So then that was kind of a coincidence then.
It was a total coincidence, but it was normal for me to be called that. So.
That's pretty cool. And speaking of the Superlatives, I know that you've been with the band ever since the band was first created. How did you become a member of the Fabulous Superlatives?
Well, he called me up on the phone one day and said, "Hey, let's have a meeting." And so we went and had lunch, and he said, "I want to put together a band with you." And he said, I'll find a drummer. Little did I know that he already had a drummer who was an old friend of mine. I'd known him since before I moved to Nashville. Harry Stinson, who I knew from Steve Earle and the Dukes when they had their big hits on the radio back in the 80s. Steve was sort of the spearhead of what we now refer to as the great credibility scare in country music. That was when we had Steve Earle on the radio having hits on country radio. Roseanne Cash was having hits. Dwight Yoakam was having hits. The O'Kanes were having hits. Lyle Lovett was on the radio having hits, and that was a rather unusual thing to have people that were writing songs that actually said something, and that hadn't really happened before, and it lasted for about 3 or 4 years, and then Garth Brooks came along and wiped it out. So, but the great credibility scare was part of Marty's thing too. That's when he was having his first hits during that time. So he was kind of part of that whole bunch of people. So anyway, Marty said, "You find a bass player. I got a drummer." So, well, he didn't tell me he had a drummer, but he did. But anyway, so I found a bass player his name was Brian Glenn, and he became our first bass player. He was with us for about 6 years probably. And then he quit, and we got Paul Martin, who was with us for about 6 or 7 years, and he quit. And we got Chris Scruggs, who is a genius. He's the best guitar player in our band. He's a really good drummer. He's the best steel player in Nashville. He's the greatest upright bass player in Nashville, and it's a fantastic electric bass player, one of my favorites of all time. And he's a wonderful singer, and he has his own band, Chris Scruggs and the Stone Fox 5. I play guitar in that band, and it's a throwback band. We play country music from 1946 to 1956. So if someone comes up and asks for George Jones, he politely says, "We don't play new country." Somebody wants to hear Waylon Jennings, he says, "We don't play new country." So it's one of those kind of bands.
Yeah, I think
that's how I got in the band.
That's pretty cool. So you knew Marty before joining the band then?
Yes, I did.
So how did you meet him?
Well, he doesn't remember the first time I met him, but I do. It was at one of those awful outdoor country music festivals that they have in the heat and it's just miserable, but it was down in Alabama. It was this band, Alabama, had their annual, what did they call it? They had some name for it. June Jam. It was their June Jam, Alabama's June Jam, down in their hometown, whatever part of Alabama they were from. So it was a big festival, and I remember it quite well. He was there, and it was, I remember it especially because there was sewage in the area behind the stage where the buses were parked. So you had to walk through raw sewage to get to the stage. And I remember my cowboy, I threw away my cowboy boots when I got home because they smelled so bad. I just put them in the dumpster, said, sayonara, I'm never going to get that smell out of there. But anyway, I met him that day. And also I remember that day because Desert Rose Band was playing, and they were wonderful. They were also part of the Great Credibility Scare. You know, Chris Hillman's band, Desert Rose, he was the bass player for the Byrds back in the 60s. And he had this country band that was having lots of hits on country radio. Really good band. So cool. And so I remember them there that day. So, and then I met him again downtown Nashville at some function. I was playing guitar with, I think I was playing guitar with George Dukas at some thing that was going on, some industry event. And he came up afterwards and said, hey man, I need to have your telephone number, you know? And so he called me a few times, and then he finally called me and said, hey, let's start a band. So that's how that all went down.
And you guys have been touring ever since.
Yeah, we have. We toured right until March the 14th, and then they canceled all our dates, and we've been home ever since. This is the longest time I've been home, not working, not playing a live show since 1974.
Wow, that's insane. You know, I had the privilege of seeing you guys in concert last year, and you were exchanging some pretty awesome guitar riffs with Steve Miller, and you were amazing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. When did you first start to learn how to play guitar?
In 1966 was when I first started playing guitar. I was when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones came on, Ed Sullivan, it changed the whole face of popular music overnight. You know, people who had big careers were pretty much left to hung out to dry, you know, and the whole face of popular music changed in about 3 weeks. And I saw the Beatles when they played Ed Sullivan. I was like, oh man, I got to get a guitar. And so somehow I ended up with some junk folk guitar that was at my house that I kind of learned to play on a little bit. And then in 1965, a friend of mine had a really nice Fender Jaguar guitar, and it was the top of the line instrument that Fender made. It was their best guitar, and he didn't play it at all. His grandmother had bought it for him, and it was brand new. I still remember the smell when you opened the case of the distinctive Fender guitar smell, you know. And he would let me borrow this thing, you know, which was amazing. You know, it was like, this is like the best guitar that the company makes, you know. And so I was playing with that, and I had a friend of mine across the street had a guitar, and we used to have put on concerts for the neighborhood kids out on his back porch. And I didn't really play very well, but I was starting to get the hang of it. You know, we were playing some of the stuff that was on the radio. I think we played Gloria by them and Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, stuff like that. And so then his father ran a radio station, and he promoted a Love and Spoonful show, who were having a bunch of hits at that time. That was the first rock concert I went to, and that did it for me because they were such a great band. You know, they had Do You Believe in Magic and What a Day for a Daydream, and their big hit at the time that I saw the show was Summer in the City, which we still hear on oldies radios, you know, oldies radio. But they were so great, you know, and such affable, cool people. And you know, I was backstage, and I got to play their lead guitar player's guitar, you know, and it's like, wow. And it was pretty cool. So I had a paper route, and I bought a brand new 1966 Telecaster in 1966 from my father's friend, who ran a music store, and he was the #1 jazz guitar player in the world at the time, technically speaking. he was more advanced than anybody. He had run the NBC orchestra back when they had live music on TV before they had pre-recorded music back in the 50s, and which was really something for a jazz guitar player to be making that kind of money. It was probably the only time in history that ever happened. And he retired, and his name was Johnny Smith. He retired. He had the #1 selling jazz record in 1954, and he retired when his wife died. He had a little girl, and he went to Colorado Springs, which was about an hour away from where I live. And I heard him play. He was the first guitar player I watched play in person. My dad used to go take me to watch him play, and I was like, wow, this guy's really good. So I bought my first guitar from his store. And since my dad was a friend of his, he gave us a discount. So I had a brand new Fender Telecaster, which is coincidentally the kind of guitar I still play.
Wow.
You know, it's like, it was very similar to this model right here. And I've been playing ever since. I started a little neighborhood band with 3 guys that were older than me. They were 17 and I was, I guess it was, they were 16 and I was 13. That's right, when I started the band. And that would have been in 67. Actually, technically, we did start when I was still 12 and at the end of 66, because it happened pretty quick after I got the guitar. So, and that band stayed together for about 4 years. And they were really good players, all of them, good singers and good players. And they, one of them still plays in church, but he's really good. They were all great. And I was lucky. They were nice people, and we had a nice little band. And we played, we started out playing all the radio stuff that was on. We could never do Beatles stuff because it was too hard. We couldn't do that. We decided, let's not even do that, because every time we hear other bands do Beatles songs, we always laugh at them because it sounds so bad. And so let's just stick with the stuff we could do. So we could do the Stone stuff and the Kink stuff, and we were doing garage rock stuff that was popular at the time, like Hey Little Girl Up by the Syndicate of Sound, and and we played some Ventures tunes, some instrumental surf rock and stuff like that. We were just for fun. We were having fun. I think our first gig, we made money. We started playing and we started making money, and that went on through about the end of 69, which by that time I really became interested in playing guitar and blues and all that stuff. And the British blues boom sort of turned me on to all the great American blues stuff that we never would have heard otherwise, because people in white suburbia didn't know who Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters were, and Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry was kind of part of that whole scene. We knew who they were, but we didn't know who Muddy Waters was. And I got to see Howlin' Wolf when I was 14, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
wow.
how weird is that? I'm 14 and I'm watching the great Howlin' Wolf. I was frightened. It was like, I've never seen anybody like this. It was so great. It's just magnificent. He was, those guys were all part of the Chicago chess record scene. They all lived in Chicago, and they were on the chess label, which was run in Chicago. So they all lived out on the South Side. And I was a big fan of that kind of music, very, very into it. The guy who lived across the street had, his father was kind of a motorhead. He had a bunch of cars that he was working on all the time, and he had a gas station, and they always had motorcycles and cars and stuff. But he was a big, his father listened to Johnny Cash, and he listened to Merle Haggard, and he listened to, who else did he? Buck Owens and the Buckaroos. And so Cash, I thought he was a pop artist because he had, the only song I was familiar with was Ring of Fire, which was played alongside, it was a hip hop radio hit, but when I was maybe 9 years old. So, you would hear Ring of Fire, and then you would hear James Brown, and then you would hear, Frankie Avalon, and then you'd hear an early Beatles record, And I didn't know that he was a country artist. I just thought he was another rock and roll star. I didn't know. And Buck Owens, they were from Bakersfield, and they had Fender Telecaster guitars, and they played with a hard driving, guitar driven sound. So I didn't really know that they were country either. And Myrtle Haggard was just great. And I just thought, man, this guy's just fabulous. These cool songs. And so I was really hooked by that kind of stuff. And which was all sort of not really Nashville country music. You know, those guys, they weren't associated with Nashville, any three of those people. You know, Johnny Cash was from Memphis, and he was on the Sun label alongside Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins and Roy Orbison and those people. And then the Haggard and Buck Owens were from Bakersfield, and they recorded at Capitol in Hollywood. So, you know, it wasn't really Nashville kind of music. And that's how I got into country music initially. So I could play that stuff too. I found it easy to play like Johnny Cash songs because, you know, they weren't very hard. You know, you grab a guitar and you could just, you know, play the, you know.
There's that Johnny Cash sound, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't terribly difficult, but my friend was wildly impressed when I did that. You know, he's like, "Wow, do that again!" You know, and so I like, "Oh, all right, this is cool. I can impress my pals with my guitar." You know, and it's not hard. So that's how I got into the whole thing. So, you know, I played in a lot of bands from, you know, from the time I was like 17, 18 years old. And when I was 19, my parents moved to Kansas. And I didn't want to move to Kansas because I was working a lot playing music. And they were going to move out in the middle of nowhere to be in business, you know, making these farming products. And I was like, I'm not going to Kansas, man. I'm staying in Denver. And which I did. And I, you know, gigged around playing music for a living. And there was a place down the street from where I lived at the time that had a country music band that played 5 nights a week. And I wandered in there one night. I had a fake ID. And I wandered in there one night to hear them, and they were fabulous. They were all old. They were probably, for me, they were like in their 50s probably. And they were really good players. And they were playing honky tonk, like Hank Williams, Little Jimmy Dickens, Lefty Frizzell, that kind of stuff. And they played some George Jones and some Ray Price and Merle Haggard and truck driving songs and that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, these guys are great. And one of them knew me. The drummer knew me from, he was a friend of my cousin's. And he said, this guy's a really good guitar player. So one thing led to another. I got hired to be their guitar player. So I could walk down the street basically and make a living playing 5 nights a week with these old guys who were way better than me. And I improved quickly because they you know, I learned a lot about country music and how to play it. And they'd been around. One of them, the leader, had worked in Nashville and had a record or two out. And the other guitar player had played for Buck Owens at one point and had been a roommate of Merle Travis out in California. So, you know, I felt like I was in good company. And the other cool thing about that job was if one of my other bands had a gig to play, they'd let me off and I could just send in a sub and I'd go play my other gig that night. I'd say, hey, do you mind if I go play this gig on Friday night? And they'd be like, as long as you get somebody to come in and play for you, yeah, that's fine. So it was very casual, but I was learning on the job, you know, and that's how I got into playing country music.
That's really awesome. Yeah, it seemed like you've been surrounded by all these different genres of music for pretty much your whole life. Who would you say are like your main musical influences?
Well, that would be my dad's jazz record collection that I heard when I was a kid. And I was so lucky, you know, to be exposed to that stuff, you know. I mean, when I was 5 years old, I knew who Count Basie and Woody Herman and Wes Montgomery and Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and Miles Davis. I knew who all those people were. And I'd heard their records and I really liked some of them, you know. I remember when I used to go put on, so my dad had this fabulous stereo and I put So What by Miles Davis because I was enamored with the sound of that song. It was like, what is it about this song that just makes me, it sounds so good to me? Why does it sound so cool? Because it was cool, you know. But there was something about So What by Miles Davis that knocked me out, still does. It was just enchanting, you know. I was enamored by that song. And so that was my number one influence, was my father's record collection. And then after that, the Beatles. And when I saw Jimi Hendrix 3 times, saw him once in 67. No, I saw him twice in 68, early 68 and late 68, and then again in 69. That was pretty big influence on me too, because, you know, he was so amazing, and so he was like from another planet. You know, when you saw him, he was like nothing had ever been. We'd never seen anything like Jimi Hendrix. And he was funny and off the cuff and really a great entertainer and spontaneous. You know, he didn't have a set regimen that he, you know, he would play whatever he felt like with his 2 other guys. And he was just amazing. You know, it was like, wow, this guy has taken all the rules of music and threw them out the window and is doing his own thing. And it's just fabulous. You know, I couldn't believe it. I was a pretty big influence. And of course, the other rock music of that time that was starting to come along, I was lucky to be in Denver, because Denver and Boulder was a big hippie place. And they were bringing in all kinds of great music to Boulder and Denver. So I saw the Grateful Dead play like 5 or 6 times before I turned 19 years old, you know. And that, at that time, the average size of their audience was about 200-300 people. This is before they became really big. But in the, you know, in the college scene, they were popular, but not maybe outside of that. They weren't ever getting radio airplay or anything. But I became a huge fan of their guitar player. His name is Jerry Garcia. And, you know, I realized these people were really, they knew a lot about music, you know, these guitar players, and they knew a lot that I didn't know. And so I kind of went back to my jazz roots, and I started taking lessons from different people. And I went through quite a few teachers trying to, you know, learn how to play for real, you know, music theory, jazz theory, all that kind of stuff, because I wanted to be like all these other people that knew all about music. And one day I was in my local music store, and there was this guy over in the corner. He looked to be maybe about 4 or 5 years older than me. And he's playing jazz on a guitar, sitting in the corner. And he was unreal. And I went up to the guy who ran the music store, and I said, "Who is that guy, man? Who is that?" And he says, "Oh, that's our new guitar instructor, Bill Frisell." I was like, "Sign me up. I want to be his new pupil." And I didn't even talk to Bill that day. And then the next week I start taking lessons from Bill Frisell, who's, you know, now a world famous jazz guitar player, you know, but at the time he was a guy that didn't know what to do with himself. He had no idea what he was going to do. He's like, "I don't want to be a regular jazz guitar player, but I don't want to play rock, and I don't want to play country, and I don't want to play soul music like everybody else. I want to do my own thing." And he ended up, after about, I studied with him for about 2 months or 3 months. And then I went in one day, he said, "This is going to be our last lesson, man." I said, "Whoa, what's going on?" And he said, "I'm moving to New York. I got to get out of here, man. I'm going to die if I stay here." And I was like, and then a couple of years later, he's playing with everybody in the modern progressive jazz world, and beyond that too. You know, he played on Nora Jones records and all kinds of stuff since then, you know, but he's still quite popular in the jazz guitar world, and we're still friends. So I really learned a lot from him about music theory, and that was a really big thing for me he connected with me more than the other teachers did. And that was very fortunate for me to have him. And, you know, my first guy I saw play guitar was the greatest jazz guitar player in the world. And, you know, and people would ask me, they were like, "Why do you play with such good technique?" And I was like, "I don't know." And then I finally figured out one day, it's because I used to watch Johnny Smith before I even had a guitar. You know, it's like, I was just like, "Oh, that's how you play the guitar." Okay. You know, I didn't know. I was so lucky to, you know, be exposed to that stuff. So those are my influences, basically.
So did those people kind of also influence you on what kind of models of guitars to buy too?
Not necessarily, really. I stuck with electric guitars. I was It was the Telecaster, the Fender Telecaster. I really wanted to play that because Jeff Beck played one in the Yardbirds. And my first guitar teacher says, you don't want to get a Fender Jaguar, man. You want to get the Telecaster, because if you want to sound like that guy, and he pointed to Jeff Beck on the cover of the Yardbirds' second album, he says, if you want to sound like that, the Jaguar is not going to sound like that. You got to get one of those, which was a cheaper guitar than the Jaguar. So I took his advice. That's why I bought the Telecaster. And then I got a Stratocaster because Jimi Hendrix played one. So, that wasn't really, I didn't really want to be a jazz guitar player, but I did want to know what they were doing. I wanted to be able to play technically like those people played. I wanted to know what it was they were doing. I didn't want to go through life without understanding all that, And I'm really glad that I did, because it served me well later on when I moved to Nashville by accident, sort of. I never planned on coming here, but I had lived in Chicago playing music with my rock band, and I'd lived in New York playing music with my rock band, and I ended up back in Denver playing country music again for a living. And a friend of mine called me, and he said, hey, man, I'm living in Nashville, and I'm playing with this band, and we just fired our guitar player. Can you get here in 2 days and go do this tour with us? And I was like, okay. So I did, and I was thinking I'm going to go to Nashville for 3 weeks and tour around the country. And I ended up, I'm still here. And that was 1987. I'm still here, just passing through.
That's pretty cool. And I know that, besides playing guitar, I know that you're a songwriter too. When did you start writing songs?
Actually, I wrote my first song when I was 13.
Wow. That's really cool. So any influence on that? Was it hard for you to write songs?
It wasn't when I started. It is now sometimes. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. It depends. Every song's its own challenge, its own thing. Sometimes they just fall out and it's the easiest thing you ever did. You can write songs sometimes in 5 minutes, you've got one done. And other times I just finished one the other day that I've been working on for years. And I have one song that I wrote 2 years ago that I'm just now learning how to play, because it's way over my head technically, but I heard it in my head and I figured it out, and I was like, wow, oh, this is really hard. And then I had to figure out how to solo over the chord changes, because I'd never encountered anything quite like this. The changes that I wrote for the song, the chord progressions and the way you have to improvise over those chord progressions, I can't use my normal routines to do that. So it's kind of cool when you write a song and then you have to work for a long time to play it. So, there are no rules. But I was lucky, my best friend's older sister had Bob Dylan records, and we used to listen to those all the time when I'd go over to my friend's house after school, because I was like, this guy's great. I love this guy. I don't know what he's saying, but I love it. Of course, his early stuff was more protest-oriented, sort of, social commentary stuff. And then when he threw that out the window, because people were expecting him to keep doing that, and he was like, I ain't gonna keep doing that, and then he started making those great records in 65, 66, like a Rolling Stone. And the first one that came on the radio was what was it called, Subterranean Homesick Blues. I just thought that was the greatest thing I'd ever heard. I went out and bought the single. I must have driven my poor mother crazy playing that thing over and over. She's like, what is that? And I was like, it's Bob Dylan, man. I thought it was the coolest thing I ever heard. I still think that's a great song, but you didn't know what he was talking about, but because he was, just playing word games, I think he was messing with everybody, which he still does. But I think that was good to have those kind of influences lyrically, because you're listening to guys that were going somewhere different with their lyrics. So all the people that I listened to, of course, the Beatles were great songwriters. Ray Davies from the Kinks was a massively great songwriter. Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys and his whoever he was writing songs with. He wrote with a bunch of different people, but they wrote really cool records, really great stuff. And then, of course, in the early 70s, all the singer-songwriters, James Taylor and people like that, they were doing good stuff. And I've been influenced by a lot of different people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always like really cool to kind of have like different, like surrounded by different cultures. Then that way you kind of get a little bit of everything.
In 1997 through 2000, I worked for Lucinda Williams, who is, one of the great all-time lyricists, and she's really, really good. Her father was a poet. He was the poet laureate of the United States for a while, and she used to wake up in the morning when she was like 12 to go to school, and Charles Bukowski would be visiting, and he'd still be at the kitchen table drinking, and she would sometimes play her songs for him. And also James Agee was a guest at their house regularly, and Flannery O'Connor was a guest there. So she had these people to critique her stuff, and I'm like, wow, you had Flannery O'Connor giving you advice about your songs. And it's like, what an influence to have those kind of people. No
wonder she's considered one of like the greatest lyricists. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, and that's because she was around people like that, and I can't imagine my children being around a lunatic like Charles Bukowski, but I don't think she was around him that much. So.
Yeah. Final question, and this one might be a little difficult, I don't know, but who is your favorite guitarist of all time, if you had to pick one?
Well, I'd say Jimi Hendrix. Got to go with Wes Montgomery too. Those two right there. Hard to top those guys. And then, oh gosh, there's so many great ones. I hate to limit myself. I mean, I've listened to everybody. I'm a big Paco de Lucia fan, the flamenco guitarist. I was fortunate to meet him by just. I met him back in the 70s and got to hang out with him one day while he was sitting and playing his guitar. I was sat there and watched him play. So then he was a great flamenco guitar player. I was quite enamored with him, and the guy who was the big flamenco star in the decades before Paco was a guy named Manitas de la Plata. I was a big fan of his. I was a big fan of Django Reinhardt, the French gypsy jazz guitar player. I was quite taken by his technique and his sound and his style and everything. And he influenced everybody, though. I mean, Les Paul and Chet Atkins both counted him as a major influence. So, and Les Paul was always an influence on people. He was an influence on most of the rock and roll guitar players from the 50s. They basically all tried to be like Les Paul. So he was a huge influence on, I mean, not only was his playing, but his guitar, the Gibson Les Paul guitar is probably the most popular rock and roll instrument of all time. If you have one that was made in 1959 now, you were sitting on about, anywhere from $350,000 to $500,000. That's what they go for now. At the time they cost $325.
Wow, yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah, it is a big difference. But anyway, they weren't popular when they came out, but now they're extremely, the 59 and 58, 59, and 60 Les Pauls are worth a lot of money. I'll tell you.
Yeah, I've researched a lot of Les Paul guitars too, and they are very expensive.
Yeah. Fortunately, they make the company that you can buy a pretty good one for about $5,000 now, brand new, and they're pretty darn good. The custom shop Les Pauls are pretty good, I have to admit.
Yeah, I think that they're definitely one of my favorite guitars. I like the sound that they have.
Yeah, me too. I've owned several in my life, but never a 59. But yeah, I like them all. I still have one.
That's really cool. Awesome. Kenny, thank you so much for being generous with your time. I really enjoyed talking to you today.